Hey guys, how are you? It's Mike from the WCA with the Week 5 update. You're taking a look at a set position, meaning we're going to talk about this a little bit before we see what actually happened or tell you where this came from. And as we had reminded the students earlier in the year, whenever you're doing set position analysis, it's important to understand the order of things that you look at. So number one, you should always look at material first. Just count the pawns and pieces to see who has more material on the board. It's a great starting point for a couple of reasons. So one, you not only find out who has more force, but it also forces you to survey the entire board. You're going to have to look at the whole board. You'll have to count the pieces. It's just a great way to warm up. And then after you do that, you start to look at things like king safety, piece activity, pawn structure. And we're going to go a little quicker this time because the position that you're looking at now is really just one of 6 snapshots that we took from a game. It's actually a game played from our 4 o'clock class between Shavai with the white pieces and Rusa playing black. So some of the positions we're going to look at did not occur, but they could have. They're variations in the game. And the reason we're doing that is we're trying to give you some insight into what a master actually sees when she plays. So, for example, a couple of these lines Shavai could have forced, and they would have turned out better than the game continuation. Rusa saw these possibilities in her mind, and the fact that Shavai didn't ended up getting him into trouble. So what we're going to do is we're going to show you the 6 positions, and then we'll show you the game from the beginning and give you guys a chance to see how these positions actually came about. Okay, so here's the first one. You'll notice that white, in this case Shavai, is down a pawn. And if you put this position on a computer, you're going to find that the computer, a strong computer I'm talking about, will find that white is not really down a pawn in terms of compensation. There is compensation here for white. You'll see that the white owns the 2 bishops, and more importantly, as I circle the black queen, you'll notice that if she gets attacked, perhaps by one of these rooks, she's kind of running short of squares. She doesn't have that many places to go. And also, if you look at the overall development of the pieces, black has nothing out except for the queen, and meanwhile the white rooks are connected and the 2 bishops stand pretty well right now. If you were to talk about king safety in this position, this is one of those funny times when a lot of students, especially in our 12 or 2 o'clock class, would immediately say that the black king is safer because he's in his castle position, and I'll just circle where he is right now, and it looks great. I mean, the pawns are here protecting him, the rook is up here, and it all looks great. But if you look at the white king, they're going to say the opposite. Well, he's exposed, he doesn't have the standard castling position. But remember, king safety is not about the location of your king. It's whether or not the king can be attacked. That's really the bottom line in king safety. Okay, so that's set position number 1. You can just glance at it, form your own opinion. Let me show you position number 2. So here was a line that could have happened in the game, and had Shavai put his bishop on g2 right here, as you'll see, he would have gotten some compensation here. Because again, count the material, and you'll see that black is up a pawn, and you would have to search for the compensation here for white. Why would a computer say that white is actually doing okay here? So at any time you can pause the video and make your own assessment of this position, and then we'll continue because you're going to see this again as we go through the game. Okay, so let me show you number 3, which is here, and this is pretty much an ideal position for white. They have caught up in material. You'll see that they have 6 pawns each, but here white not only owns the bishop pair, but in this particular position you'll see this whole complex of dark squares are going to fall into white's control, making it difficult for black to really get that much done. This knight has to do some serious maneuvering to find a good square, and right now this bishop on c8 is very, very passive, literally doesn't have a move. So this would be an ideal position and something that could have come about in the game. Now, I'm not I don't think Russo would have allowed this position, but remember, Shavai in the 4 o'clock class is not going to be playing International Masters. He's going to be playing players of his own strength, slightly higher, and it's quite possible that this position could have came up. All right, so again, please just pause the video anytime you want to make your own assessment about these positions. All right, let's take a look at number 4. Some interesting features here. You're down 2 pawns as white, which is the most that you've seen so far. The other 2 positions, when you were down material, you were only down 1 pawn. Here you're down 2. But there are some factors that actually start to even this game out. Black with that much material will probably have some edge, but keep in mind that white has 2 very active bishops right here. The knight is defended only by the rook, which is being attacked right now. This rook on g8 doing a terrific job of pinning this bishop, because if it moves, you're going to lose a rook in the corner. So these kinds of ideas, once you master them, you begin to show more confidence in games when you're down material. Because as soon as you go down material, let's say you hang a pawn in a position, there's really 2 ways to look at it. 1, you can start getting depressed, oh, I just hung a pawn, this is not good. Or 2, remember what you're learning from these classes. Always look for resources. If you're down a pawn, there's a chance that that pawn had to open something up. It had to open either a diagonal or a file. So your first reaction should be find compensation. Find a way to make use of the fact that your own pawn is not on the board. Okay, and finally, let's take a look at these 2 here. What's going on here? It looks like there's 2 pawns again missing. And the problem for black here is, aside from being behind in development, again, the same bishop up here on c8, but the other feature to keep in mind here is the fact that the players possess bishops of opposite color. And when that happens, very often it's difficult for the player. Let's say, for example, you have the light squared bishop. If white can start an attack on the dark squares, you're going to be essentially a piece down, because this bishop can't participate in the defense. So here, this is a strange position. Clearly an endgame, but you have to watch out with this bishop on f6. This is acting something like a pawn wedge. So, you know, you can imagine in your mind this bishop being here on d7. Well, then what happens if a rook checks up here? There's no escape for that king. So this bishop on f6 is really, really well placed. And you'll see again in the game if this could have been a possible variation. And then I'm going to show you now the final position of the game, which is bad for white. And if you look here, you'll see that you're down the 2 pawns again, but the compensation is very, 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 it's not here really, because the bishops are of the same color. The bishop on d7 is developed, and the black king is probably going to just shelter himself on e7. There's no attack on the dark squares. He'll protect all his central pawns, and in this case, the class had ended, but Rusa has you know, a winning position here, or at least clearly better. Okay, so let's go to the beginning of the game quickly and get you into these set positions. All right, so Shavai has white. He opens with e4. And Rusa is a lifelong Sicilian player. So knight f3, e6, and Shavai goes for an open Sicilian. And for the younger kids watching the video, remember, an open Sicilian is when white trades their d pawn for black's c pawn, which will open up the game. So Rusa takes, knight takes, and again, let me use the mouse pointer here to show you. You see how the d file is opened up, and both bishops for white can come out very quickly. This is sort of an open area here in the middle, so these games tend to get very tactical quickly, and usually with lots of action. Now, what's in it for black? Well, there are so many different variations of the Sicilian. In this particular one, as in other Sicilians, you'll notice that black has 2 center pawns to white's 1. So in the future, black is going to try to use these pawns to guard squares in the center, to break in the center. There's lots of options. So Sicilian players have to be pretty good at knowing how to use these pawns and how to set them up. Okay, so in this position, Rusa plays a6, which is her main opening, and it's been her main opening for many years. These can turn into Paulson Sicilians, and sometimes they'll call it a Kan, K-A-N Sicilian. You guys don't really need to know the names, but it's pretty good to know some of the ideas at least. A6 looks like a strange move to play in the opening, especially if you have the black pieces, but it's quite useful because in a lot of these structures, the queen here on d8 very often develops to the c7 square. By putting her there right away, you have to be careful that this knight, for example, doesn't pop into b5 and attack her, or this knight, after it comes to c3, will sometimes come into the b5 square and attack the queen. So a6 kind of supports that square for the queen, and also in the future will allow this b pawn to push up to b5 without being taken, and that would get the light square bishop in the game. Those are just a couple of the options. This is really a very flexible opening that she's playing. Okay, so knight c3, developing the piece, and as we mentioned, there's queen c7, and Shavai plays one of the rarer moves in this position, but it's been played by, you know, very, very strong players, and he plays the move f4. And by playing f4, he creates this pawn duo, and a duo acts more like a piece than just a couple of pawns, because they're so flexible and they have so many options. I mean, this pawn can push up to e5, this pawn could come to f5 and break. They could just sit there the way they are now and control this whole series of squares, and then try to use your imagination and picture white castled kingside. And if they're castled kingside, this rook here on h1 will be here on f1. So that would be supporting the advanced f pawn for white. Now that sounds great. So you guys should be asking the question, well, if this is such a great idea, why isn't it the most popular move in this position? Well, again, you can pause your video to figure that out, but it shouldn't be too hard for you guys to understand. This is a weakening move. Any pawn move that you make is double-edged. You always strengthen squares ahead of the pawn. So in this case, the f4 pawn is controlling e5 and g5, and it's working well with its neighbor here on e4. But don't forget, this is one of the pawns that guards the king when he's castled. So this g1 to a7 diagonal is now open. So you do get a whole bunch of benefits for moving that pawn, but please remember, you did not develop a piece. You moved a pawn, and you did open some squares around your king. So it is double-edged. Okay, so Rusa plays bishop to b4, pinning the knight, and Shavai develops his queen to f3, which would keep an eye on that knight because it's now it was being attacked twice. Rusa plays knight f6, and from this position we have the opportunity as white, our first opportunity, to move this pawn with a tempo. And that too is double-edged. So for example, if you play e5, black is not going to retreat that knight to the back rank. It's going to come forward. So for example, it could come right into d5, and that would hit this knight twice. I'm sorry, 3 times. You see the bishop, the knight, and the queen, and it's only protected twice by the pawn on b2 and the queen on f3. If you protect it naturally, you can go through a whole sequence of trades here, and I want you to see this because it's could be a set position, but we didn't use it, but we could have. And why am I saying that? Once white takes back, you'll see that you have weakened white's structure, and you would think that white is automatically worse because of that, because the other compensation you might look for is, well, does white have the bishop pair? Well, they don't. It's bishop and knight, and it's the same color bishop. But white has this knight on d4, And if you look at the pawn structure here, it's not easy to get rid of this piece. You can't challenge it with your light squared bishop. If you want to take it, you're going to have to take it with either a rook, and that's going to cost you an exchange, or you're going to have to take it with this knight. If you ever do, you'll see that I could take back with the c pawn, the first c pawn, and that would undouble all of white's pawns. So this knight being centralized and very strong would clearly compensate white for having these weak pawns over here. The king could maybe come to d2 to guard this pawn if it gets attacked. Remember, there's no dark square bishop for white. Okay, so this easily could have been one of the set positions, but instead we chose this one. So let me go back for you here. So after knight f6, Shivai could have played e5, right? So Rusa could tactically, and knowing her, she probably would have played the move knight e4, which is a nice tactical shot. It looks weak because the queen on f3 can just take it, but if she does, that's going to pull her away from the defense of the c3 knight. So she would take on c3, and it's not best for you to take that bishop with your pawn here, because the queen will take back, forking the rook and the king. Best to just get out of the way, just get out of the check, and then white could grab a pawn here. And let me show you how. And this is going to lead us right into our first set position. The pawn on c2 is indirectly being attacked by the queen. This queen on e4 is protecting that, but if we take, then you'll see that you've taken that pawn's protection away. Rusa could take, and you could move either bishop really to get out of check, but bishop e2 gets it out of the way, and let's say black castles here, and this is leading us right into the first set position that you guys looked at. You're down a pawn, but again, the compensation that we talked about, look at white's development. Question: is the black queen on c2 a strong piece, or is it actually vulnerable? Can she be attacked there? You can envision one of these rooks coming to this square very quickly, and when she goes, she's short of squares. She doesn't really have that many flight squares that are active, number one, and number two, white is going to get complete control of this open file. So if you had gotten to this position, and you see how you could have, this clearly could have been something playable for both sides. Okay, so back to here, Shivai chose not to play this move e5, and instead he simply developed a piece, and he broke the pin on the bishop on this square, which is terrific. He's playing really, really well. Rusa plays d6. Now, these pawn moves, I want you to take a look at this duo, and we'll compare it to this duo for a moment. The d6 e6 duo, and let's talk about this a6 pawn as well. You'll notice that this entire array of pawns are only on black's third rank. White's pawn duo is out on the fourth rank, so all of you should know that that gives white more space. However, this pawn structure is incredibly solid, and many authors and writers refer to structures like this sometimes as hedgehog structures. So you can think of a hedgehog or a porcupine being something that is really not going to bother you unless you try to approach it. And this is so similar. These pawns at any moment can break at e5 or d5. d5 is usually a very dynamic break for black in these structures. This b pawn could push forward. So this is sort of like a coiled spring. So when Rusa puts these pawns like this, she's got a lot of energy behind this structure, and at the right moment she'll break through. So now how to play as white against this. Shivai plays a really, really interesting move, and I like his move a lot. He plays the move g4. It's risky, again, because he's leaving his king in the center of the board. He's not developing a piece, and we all have learned the hard way that pawns don't go backwards. But consider moves like h6 in response to that. A lot of players, 1600, 1800, they're going to play the move h6 because they think it's going to slow down White's attack, that this pawn won't advance so quickly. So let's say White just castles. Well, if you castle as Black, then the move h4 will come, and all of a sudden you're walking headfirst into this really, really strong pawn storm. And you'll notice that Black's counterplay against the White king is not nearly as fast. So over the board, this would be something that White would enjoy playing, I think, a little more than Black. Okay, so Rusa, a very experienced hedgehog player and Sicilian player, obviously is not going to panic and walk into something, so she just plays knight c6, which immediately creates a threat here on d4. Shavai could have retreated the knight, but he made a trade, which is sensible because, he had to deal with the threat somehow. The queen took, and here Shavai castles. Now, if you don't castle, you have the option in this position to play the move bishop g2, which protects this pawn because it's now being attacked twice. And remember that this bishop can remove one of the defenders at any moment. So bishop g2 would have been a sensible alternative, but Shavai just castles and gives up the pawn. Now, this is not an easy decision for Rusa to make. And remember, she's playing Shavai in the class because there's an odd number of players. And had this been a tournament game, we don't know if she would have gone for this because he is offering her a pawn and she took it. So by taking, she gives up her bishop, but now that loosens the pawn on e4, which she takes. And in this position in the game, Shavai took the queen straight away. But I want to back you up and show you, instead of taking the queen, here, what if he had played bishop to g2? And this should look familiar. This was your set position number 2. So what masters can do is, back in this position, they can say to themselves, wait a minute, I don't have to take that queen. It's not checkers, another big line of Rusas. Chess is not checkers. You don't have to take. I can kind of see in my mind's eye, if I push myself, that by playing bishop to g2, now I'm giving Black a problem. This queen is now being attacked twice with the battery here. Maybe I'm going to get some play by just forcing Black to do something. So what could Black do? Well, they could take, and you could take back. And this position, again, material-wise, you'll see that Black is up a pawn, but, I'll put a couple of highlights there. This d6 pawn is going to be weak for a little bit. If you push it to d5, you will stop it from being captured, but you're going to start putting lots of your pawns on light squares, and this bishop up here that's highlighted can become a really bad piece in a hurry. So let's go back for a minute. What if you try to support your queen with a move like d5? Then Black would or could get hit with a move g5, hitting the knight. So now watch what happens if you decide to exchange and retreating your knight to, let's say, d7. Black could take on g7, rook attacks, and lo and behold, you have set position number 3. So I just wanted to give you guys an idea of how we got to these set positions. This, this could easily have happened in a game. So here, the compensation you don't need because the material is equal, but I like White a lot here. This, especially this dark squared bishop with all of these open dark squares on the board. Black is really behind in development, and just with these holes, the rooks connected, I think White is doing really, really well here. Okay, so what happened in the game, though, Shavai took. And when he took, Rusa takes back, and his idea was to grab this pawn on g7, which worked out okay. The rook attacked the bishop naturally. Bishop goes back to d4, and that allows Black to take off the pawn on g4, which she does. And here, Shavai had a chance to, again, play the most challenging moves you can to your opponent. He played bishop d3, which is really good. It attacks an undefended piece, connects your rook, but perhaps more challenging would have been to go after the rook immediately on g1, because if he or if she tries to defend the rook, for example, with pawn h5, you could trade the rooks, which would weaken that pawn, attack the knight. If the knight is defended by a pawn, you can go into one of these trades here where you kind of force these positions with bishops of opposite color. And let me show you a nice move in this kind of position. It's the move bishop f6, which is a nice idea. What it does is it gets this pawn, it kind of fixes it. It stops it from moving, because if this pawn can't move, that means the pawn here on e4 and the pawn on g4 are going to be left undefended. So this rook could probably come and just pick these guys off. And with this bishop covering all these dark squares, it's going to be hard for white to kind of break out of this. So even though white is down some material, I think he would have done okay in that position. Okay, so rook g1. You also could have snapped off a pawn here on f4. If that's the case, then the rook on g1 could check. The king goes to e7, and here's set position number 4, where we showed you this move, bishop e3. And here, white has a fair amount of compensation for those two pawns. Namely, this rook here has this bishop pinned, which is going to keep this rook out of the game, and this bishop from moving for a while. The two bishops here for white are very active. This one is attacking the rook. The rook has to be very careful where it moves for obvious reasons, because these bishops have all sorts of threats that could come about. So is white winning here? Clearly not. They're down a couple of pawns. So the question is this a playable position? Probably is. And remember, if Shivai got this with the ideas that he's learning in the class, that how to play with resources, he could probably do pretty well in these positions, even though he's down material. Okay, so what he decided to do in the game is bishop to d3, attacking the knight, and Rusa grabs the pawn on f4. The rook is challenged immediately. She goes to h4, and Shivai plays in this position bishop f2, which got him into a lot of trouble. Let's take a look at another idea. Can we force this position into one of the opposite colored bishop setups that we looked at? We can. So he could actually take this, which feels like you're breaking a rule. Like you tell your students all the time, look, don't trade down when you're down material. But here we're trading off with a clear purpose. Maybe put the bishop on f6. That's familiar to you, right? And this is set position number 5 that you saw. So from here, try to recall where white's compensation came from. It's hard at first, and believe me, playing this over the board with white is not going to be the most fun you've ever had. But if you learn some of these ideas, you'll be able to find some resources. These three pawns actually form a barrier around the king, and they are very strong, but it's hard for them to advance onto dark squares without being captured. And if they stay on light squares, they're going to kind of inhibit or slow down this bishop here on c8. Another idea is if you put the bishop on d7, remember we mentioned earlier there could be a mating threat up here. This bishop is acting like a pawn wedge. Very, very strong piece. So would I want to be white in this position? Absolutely not. But if I have to be down 2 pawns, this is probably the route that you should take. Okay, so in the game what happened was Shivai moved his bishop to f2, attacking the rook, and Rusa just instantly goes for this trade down, which left you with set position number 6. This is bad news for white. Same amount of material we had a moment ago, bishop against bishop, white down 2 pawns, but you can see the differences here. Primarily, you have no dark square control. Once this king comes to e7, these rooks are not going to be able to penetrate. number one. Number two, the bishops being of the same color are going to make all of those tricky endings with bishops of opposite color impossible. So this would be a long uphill struggle for white, and he ended up losing this position anyway. So anyway, if you have the time, you can go over the game again, and if you don't have time to see the whole video, go through the beginning and just look at the set positions that we gave you and make sure that they make sense. And remember, it's never perfect, so if there's something in that video that you disagree with, come into class and let us know. We'd love to chat about it. All right? Okay, guys, we'll see you on Sunday.